What's up, everyone? Coach Tony from Bomvex Strength with another episode of Ask Coach Tony. And today's question comes from Michael again. He gets 2 weeks in a row because he asked a bunch of really good questions. And this week's question is, should there be a difference in the way that powerlifters and bodybuilders train for hypertrophy? And the short answer is yes. And now I'm going to give you a long answer. And I'll preface this by saying that hypertrophy training, I think, is incredibly important for powerlifters and strength athletes in general. Mass moves mass. The more contractile tissue that you carry, the greater your potential for force output. And while strength is largely neurological, a product of our nervous system, our coordination, our neurological efficiency, you got to have some sort of horsepower behind it. And the more muscle you carry, all things considered, two lifters with the same neurological efficiency, the same sort of technique, the one who carries more muscle tissue is probably going to be the stronger lifter in the long run. And I will also preface this by saying I'm super glad that early on in my strength training career, I spent a lot of time focusing on just very stereotypical bodybuilding training. And ironically, I was doing it to try to get better for college baseball. Probably not the most intelligent thing to do, but I'm super glad that it set a really good foundation for my powerlifting career moving forward. And I think a lot of more kind of like new age powerlifters, younger powerlifters who are getting involved in the sport as kind of their first foray into strength training kind of do themselves a disservice by not spending more time building themselves a good base of muscle tissue. So, all right, let's get into it. The mechanisms for hypertrophy are the same, regardless of whether you're a powerlifter, whether you're a bodybuilder, whether you're a team sport athlete. We build muscle tissue the same way. We all kind of come from the same biology underneath the hood, so to speak. So it's always going to be mechanical tension. That's the number one driver of hypertrophy, taking a muscle close to failure and kind of straining through that those last couple of tough reps at the end of a set. And you're going to have other kind of secondary mechanisms as well. You can argue about the internet on that for a long, long time if you want, but knowing that mechanical tension is number one, and there are several other secondary mechanisms that you can focus on. But basically, regardless of who you are, in order to build muscle, you got to take a target muscle group pretty close to failure and train it with enough volume to, add some progressive overload over time. So how would I train powerlifters versus bodybuilders differently for hypertrophy? I think the first thing that you would look at is what muscle groups you're going to prioritize. A bodybuilder obviously has to have a lot of symmetry and they got to bring up weak muscle groups, etc. A powerlifter really has to focus mostly on the main movers, right? So you have to ask yourself, what is the primary muscle group that's going to move the bar for each of the competition lifts? For squat, it's going to be quads and glutes. For the bench press, it's going to be pecs, shoulders, triceps. For the deadlift, it's going to be hamstrings, glutes, and of course having a lot of upper back for the isometric component of it. But all three lifts are going to have, stabilizing muscle groups that are going to kind of be like protective in a way, muscle groups that are going to support the eccentric part of the lift. All of those have to be taken into consideration. And there are some muscle groups that just aren't all that important for powerlifters. Probably don't have to train your calves directly ever. Probably don't have to train a lot of medial deltoids because they're just not all that involved in the bench press. Kind of depending on the way that you squat would probably determine how much hamstring work you would do to support the squat. The way that you deadlift is going to determine how much you train your quads and your adductors. But you probably don't have to spend a ton of time working on things like medial delts, things like biceps, things like calves, but those big main movers, so like quads, the entirety of your upper back, pecs, triceps, the things that are the main movers for your big lifts. It's not that hard to figure out what those are, so just make sure that those muscle groups are really, really big. And then you're also looking at things like muscular balance, things like antagonist muscle groups, so the opposite of the main movers. I know I just said there are certain muscle groups that you don't have to focus on all that much, but I think just by nature of the way that powerlifting is, sometimes you can develop muscular imbalances where you might just have a lot of muscle tissue and a lot of use on one side of the joint, and it might behoove you to add some muscle tissue to the other side of the joint. So I talked a lot about maybe not needing to train the biceps all that much, but if you do a ton of pressing and a ton of direct tricep work, it might help your elbows feel better and reduce wear and tear in the long run if you train a little bit more elbow flexion instead of always just training elbow extension. The same could go for the lower back, right? If the lower back gets super fatigued and super taxed from doing a lot of heavy squatting and deadlifting, adding some muscle tissue to your anterior core, your rectus abdominis, your internal obliques, muscles in the front side of the body, the core muscles, could go a long ways in just being kind of protective in nature and creating some muscular balance. That's not super scientific. That's more just from an experience standpoint. When powerlifters are training for hypertrophy, you have to take into account the joint stress that is created by that hypertrophy training and how it balances into an overall training program that's already probably creating a lot of joint stress just because of the way that the barbell lifts kind of beat the shit out of you, right? You train heavy for a long time, you get a lot of wear and tear in shoulders, elbows, low back, hips, knees. You want your hypertrophy training to not add too much additional joint stress. So that's where exercise selection becomes really important and the rep ranges that you choose become really important. So you kind of have to pay attention to your body and see how certain exercises affect those joints, right? So like if you wanted to add muscle to your deltoids, obviously doing some sort of overhead press would be a great option. But if overhead pressing doesn't agree with your shoulders because you do a ton of bench pressing and you do a ton of low bar squatting and exercises that you kind of wear on the shoulders, you might have to be a little bit more strategic. Maybe instead of a barbell or a dumbbell overhead press, maybe I'm looking at more machines like a plate loaded shoulder press, or doing something like a landmine press or a Viking press, something that's a little bit more joint friendly. I think of this especially for like the elbows. I think that's huge. A lot of the best mass builders for the triceps are also notoriously hard on the elbows, right? Like heavy dumbbell tricep extensions, heavy skull crushers, heavy JM presses, dips, things like that just like beat the shit out of your elbows. And it sucks because those are the things that make your triceps huge and probably make your bench a lot better. But you can add a lot of joint stress really fast by kind of overdoing it with exercises that don't necessarily agree with the joints that around the muscle that you're targeting. So you have to really pay attention to the way that hypertrophy exercises make your joints feel, right? We want to add tissue to the muscle. We don't want to add too much stress to the joints. And then I reference rep ranges as well. I think this is really, really underrated. So I've talked a lot about hypertrophy rep ranges and how kind of that typical like 8 to 12 rep range or 10 to 15 rep range or whatever is kind of a misnomer. You can build muscle tissue with an incredibly wide range of reps, probably as low as 5 reps per set all the way up to or upwards of 30 reps per set. We just know that the lower the reps per set and the heavier the loading, the more joint stress you're probably going to accumulate. So if you're somebody who feels really banged up from doing a lot of squat, bench, and deadlift, and you really want to avoid extra joint stress during your hypertrophy training, I would just recommend using really high rep ranges, right? 15, 20, 25, 30 reps per set. We know that as long as a set is taken close to muscular failure, between 1 to 3 reps shy of failure, 1 to 3 reps in reserve, that you're probably going to get pretty much the same hypertrophy benefits, and just those higher rep ranges are probably going to beat up your joints a little bit less. So opt for those higher rep ranges. When I'm training a powerlifter for hypertrophy, I also take into consideration where they are in their competitive season. There should be phases or seasonality to hypertrophy training. Obviously, if you've just done a powerlifting meet and there's no competition on the horizon, you can put a ton of time and effort into hypertrophy training. You can do a lot of volume, do a lot of frequency, train muscle groups pretty often if the need to improve the barbell lifts is not all that immediate. As you get closer to a meet, you have to manage your fatigue a little bit more, and you're probably not going to do quite as much hypertrophy training if the volume and / intensity specificity of your competitive lifts is much, much higher. There's just not going to be as much time and energy. You don't want to add all that additional fatigue, because while we think of like heavy barbell training as being like really fatiguing to the central nervous system, takes a lot of time to recover. If you're doing a ton of volume training muscles really close to failure, that's fatiguing too, right? It all kind of there's a recovery cost to everything. So as you get closer to a meet, you probably got to pull some of that hypertrophy training back to manage your fatigue. I think it's also really important to consider where somebody is within one's weight class. Powerlifting is a weight control sport. So if you're very low in your weight class and you have a lot of room to fill out your weight class, then by all means get fucking huge, right? Put on a lot of additional mass and muscle tissue. But if you're somebody who's closer to the top end of their weight class or somebody who constantly has to cut down, you have to be a little bit more careful about how much tissue you add, right? If you are constantly having to cut several pounds every competition, if you put on 10 additional pounds of muscle mass during an off season, then like, what are you going to do? Do you want to go up a weight class? Do you want to stay in the weight class that you're in? And also consider that if you are actively cutting weight, trying to make weight, you're going to be in a caloric deficit. You're not going to have the extra calories to go towards putting on more muscle tissue. So doing a lot of hypertrophy training in a caloric deficit is kind of a waste of time. So those are the things that I would consider for a power lifter while training for hypertrophy. Getting jacked is fun. Getting jacked is important for being really, really strong. So take those things into consideration when you are programming for hypertrophy, choosing exercises, choosing rep ranges, all that good stuff. So if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can catch the next video. If you want me to answer one of your questions on a future Ask Coach Tony video, make sure you ask that question in the comments.